There are secrets in Azeroth guarded by the most treacherous of foes, some tucked away behind these swirling gateways. Going it alone may have worked up to this point, but to take on dungeons, you'll need more than just your own wits and brawn. You need a team, and you're not the only one who wonders what lies in store behind these instance portals. But first, let's get you as prepared as we can, and talk about what's in these dungeons. Dungeons are one of the most beloved things about World of Warcraft. Running dungeons is easily my favorite thing to do, but what makes them so fun? Why do people do them? Do you even have to? Well, to answer these questions and more, let's just take a look at what a dungeon is and what dungeons there are. Dungeons, also known as instances, are places that are cut off from the rest of the world, separated in their own, well, instance. There are dungeons for people of any level, starting at about 13 or 17, technically depending on your faction. Each dungeon has a required level for entry, but more importantly, they have a suggested level range. You'll need a group of 5 people to take on these dungeons, but we'll talk about grouping next time. Now, a dungeon isn't just some random area or series of rooms with mobs thrown in. The primary reason that dungeons are so difficult and requiring of a full group is that most of the enemies you find in the dungeon will be elite mobs. We talked about this in episode 3, but elite mobs will say they are of a certain level, but will have considerably more health and deal considerably more damage than a non-elite mob of the same level. What's important is things that scale by level affect the mob the same way they would a non-elite mob. For example, let's say I'm level 20 and I have 2 level 20 mobs here. One is elite, the other is not. Because your chance to hit with spells and attacks is pretty much entirely dependent on your level and your opponent's level, you basically have the same chance to hit either the elite or non-elite mob. So even though you're fighting a mob that has the same health and does the same damage as a mob that would be nearly 10 levels above it, say level 30, you'll actually be able to land attacks and spells on it. If I were actually fighting a level 30 non-elite mob, it would actually be harder because I just simply wouldn't be able to hit him as much. And so, on top of having mostly elite mobs in dungeons, mobs also usually have mechanics. And by mechanics, I mean that they have spells, abilities, or behaviors that you and your group have to strategize and play around. For example, in Wailing Caverns, Druids of the Fang will cast Sleep, incapacitating you or a party member for about 10 to 15 seconds. Your party should be prepared to counter this, either by interrupting the spellcast with a kick or counterspell type ability, or by countering the sleep effect itself with something like Grounding Totem. Also to mention, you're not just going to be fighting that one mob. Mobs come in packs, so you're going to have to juggle the knowledge of what that guy is going to do, plus whatever the other mobs are going to be doing in the same pack. So you'll want to polymorph, aka sheep, one of the mobs. Maybe a rogue will be able to sap one of the mobs, and then you take on the fight. Oh, and keep a lookout for patrols, aka pats. Some packs of mobs will just walk throughout the dungeon, so remember to look behind you. Okay, so back to dungeons, and in the background, I'll show some info on each of the dungeons starting from low levels to high levels. So why do people do dungeons? Well, the primary reason is to get XP and level up. However, simply doing the dungeon doesn't really give you any more XP than, say, just questing or grinding. The dungeon quests are where you really get a huge chunk of XP. On top of that, the quests often give some insanely good gear for your level. In the lower level dungeons, generally speaking, the quests will give better gear than the bosses. Nearing the end game level dungeons, though, you'll start seeing the bosses themselves dropping the good gear rather than the quests alone. Regardless, some things that you should look into before every single dungeon is the bosses you'll encounter and what loot they drop. You can find this by either going to classic.wowhead.com or classicdb.ch. Wowhead.com is probably the better option, probably more reliable source and more intuitive to use. Personally though, I like to use classicdb.ch because I'm just so used to it, having played on private servers for a while. I also like classicdb because they show you where the bosses spawn on the map. That said, on either website, take the information for the item drop rates with a huge chunk of salt. Can't be sure where they get that information, and in my experience, it's been very hit or miss. Or instead of using either of these websites, look up an add-on called Atlas, Atlas Loot, and Atlas Quest. I currently don't know what add-ons will be supported and what are made so far for 1.13 Classic WoW Client, but I can tell you this, I run very few add-ons, but if I can find these, I'll be using them. As well as telling you the loot you get from every boss in every dungeon, and every quest in every dungeon, it gives you a full map of the dungeon. Oh, by the way, if you're in a dungeon and you press M, you'll notice you'll just get the world map, not the dungeon map and your location on it. That just wasn't a thing in Classic. I know, it's kind of annoying. Okay, so a couple things to note about dungeons. First, I said in the beginning, and you'll be seeing on screen, suggested levels. I say suggested for two reasons. Yes, a level 10 player may be able to go into Ragefire Chasm, but unless they're a healer, they won't do nearly as much as someone who is at least level 13. This isn't because level 13s have more spells or they do more damage necessarily. I mean, of course they're true statins, but the importance is that your level compared to your enemy's level determines your hit chance to them. Remember that? On top of that, you're not going to be able to be using any of the quests in that dungeon because you're probably too low level. And like I said before, quests are one of the main reasons you want to be doing dungeons in the first place while leveling. They are your main source of XP. There are a few dungeons that are definitely more catered towards one faction than the other, mostly due to location. For example, Ragefire Chasm is a level 13 through 18 dungeon located inside Orgrimmar, so there's nothing saying an Alliance player can't do the dungeon, but there's really no reason to because the gear from the bosses is meh. There are no Alliance quests, and the location is literally located inside the Horde capital city. Likewise for the Alliance, the stockades are located inside Stormwind, so no reason for the Horde to attempt this dungeon. Also, you may remember meeting stones. In fact, you'll be seeing some of them in these clips here. They were added in patch 1.3 as a sort of group finder mechanic where you could get automatically grouped with people, though I personally don't remember them being used so much. They are not summoning stones. In the Burning Crusade expansion, these stones could be used by 3 players to summon another player from their group to the location, being outside the dungeon. If you want to do this, in Classic, you'll need a Warlock with the summon ability. Probably the last thing to note, there are some dungeons that are split up into sections. For example, Scarlet Monastery has 4 different instance portals and is comprised of 4 totally different instances. However, they're all shorter than a normal dungeon. As you probably saw, they were named Graveyard, Library, Armory, and Cathedral. In a similar manner, there are some other dungeons with multiple instance portals, but they are just separate instances to the same instance. For example, the back entrance to Uldaman, located in Midwestern Badlands. Now, I'm not going to go into a guide in each and every one of these dungeons. However, thankfully, I've recently found a series that SK111 is making for each dungeon. He starts out with the lore, goes over general info about the dungeon, even talks about what quests there are and where to get them, and some of the most notable loot. Check him out, shower him with love. He's doing an amazing job. So that's pretty much everything you need to know about dungeons. But now we actually have to do the dungeon, and I certainly can't do it by myself. So next time, let's talk about grouping up, because you know what they say, it's dangerous to go alone.